Hello, greetings everyone. Welcome to Indagando en la Biblia, Inquiring the Bible. Here, Professor Pedro Rosario Barbosa. Welcome to our channel where we discuss matters academically without being academia. Today, our guest is Dr. Helen Bond, a professor at the School of Divinity of the University of Edinburgh. She has written on topics such as Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, the historical Jesus, and the Gospel of Mark as the first Greco Roman biography of Jesus. Today, we're going to talk about Pontius Pilate. I highly encourage reading her book, Pontius Pilate in History and Interpretation, published by Cambridge University Press. Welcome, Dr. Bond. It is an honor to have you here at Indagando en la Biblia.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. I'm looking forward to talking about Pontius Pilate.
Okay, let's begin with the most basic question. Who was Pontius Pilate? And what was the historical background where he lived, why he ended up prefect of Judea, etc.?
Well, he's most famous then as the prefect of Judea from roughly 26 CE to very late 36 or early 37. So he was a prefect of Judea for about 10 years or so. Now, we don't really know anything about his life before that. We know he's a Roman knight, so he's a Roman aristocrat. He's rich, wealthy, probably from Italy, and probably he had some kind of military training because his post in Judea, prefect, is largely a military post. Judea had only been a Roman province for about 20 years. And so Pilate's job is to maintain order and sort of get the people used to Roman rule. And so he's probably come to the emperor's attention as a skilled military man. Maybe he's led troops in Germany or somewhere like that. And so he gets appointed to prefect of Judea in 26 CE. He stays a decade in the province, which is pretty good going for those times. So probably suggests that he was reasonably good at his job. He was good at making sure there were no riots, keeping the people reasonably happy, although that wasn't really his main job. And then when he goes at the end, in late 36 or early 37, we hear nothing about him again. There's some later Christian texts that speculate on whether he became a Christian or whether he had a terrible death because of what he did to Jesus, but none of them can be trusted, really. The chances are he probably got sent to another posting somewhere, either a military posting or another province, but we just don't hear anything more about him.
One of the most interesting things uh, I've seen in your book is regarding the fact that everyone has a portrait of who Pilate was. Even the Soviet Union. I was very surprised by that datum. And I want to begin with the way that he was presented in antiquity. I what does what do the historians say at the time, like Philo of Alexandria or Josephus?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to realize they are no more historians than the Gospels are. So, if we're going to be skeptical about some of the portrait of Pilate in the Gospels, we also need to be similarly skeptical about what Josephus and Philo say, because I think what's interesting about these characters, and also in the modern period, as you say, is that everybody seems to use Pilate as a character to think with. So they're not really interested in the historical Pilate, but they're interested in using Pilate in some way to make other points. So we get a lot of information about him from Josephus. And Josephus was a Jewish historian a Jewish general who then went to Rome, changed sides, and started writing histories of the Jewish people. But of course, they have their own particular slant. They're trying to present Judaism in a particular way, to say that, you know, despite the bad things that have happened in the recent Jewish war, Jews are a distinguished and respectable religion. And so Josephus tells us quite a lot about Philo, about Pilate. It's from Josephus that we get his dates. His work, The Jewish War, tells us 2 events in the time of Pilate, and his longer work, The Antiquities of the Jews, written around about sort of 94 CE, gives us a couple more stories. It tells us about Jesus in a passage that may have been heavily edited by Christians, and it also tells us how Pilate lost his role in the province of Judea in around about 36. So that gives us quite a lot more information. But you have to remember that although Josephus he's very loyal to Rome. He wants to you know, he's very positive towards Rome because they are his benefactors now. He also wants to try and excuse the people for what happened, and he does often use Roman governors as you know, he says that they were generally insensitive, and it was because of misrule of the Roman governors that people were gradually sort of brought on to revolt in 66. And then we have another story about Pilate in the writings of Philo of Alexandria, who was actually a contemporary of Pilate. And he tells one story about Pilate where Pilate set up some shields in the Praetorium in Jerusalem. And supposedly all the people started to complain about these shields because they didn't have a picture on them, but they said something that the people found offensive. And probably this was something to do with the title of the emperor, the fact that he is son of the divine Augustus or Pontifex Maximus, something like that. Anyway, the people are, through the Herodian princes, they appealed to Caesar, who then, according to Philo, was really angry and told Pilate to get rid of these shields and put them in the temple of Augustus in Caesarea. And the interesting thing about Philo is that he actually gives us a character description of Pilate, and it is really, really bad. It says that he was everything that was bad. He was greedy. He sent people to prison or executed them without fair trials. He was only interested in what he could get out of things for himself. It's this long list of bad things about him. And some people have read that and said, well, you know, Philo is, he's a contemporary of Pilate. He must know. But the difficulty is, if you read the whole of Philo, he's very dramatic. You know, you're either everything that's good or everything that's bad. And particularly anybody who sets themselves up against the Jewish law is bad. And Pilate comes into this category. So we have to be a little bit careful with all of these accounts. We're in a really good position in that we have a lot of information, but we just have to be a little bit careful about it.
Yeah, as you talked about Josephus, one of the things I noticed is that, and I think you noticed, is that in one of Josephus' stories, apparently he describes Pilate more positive toward the Jews, while in another event, he described Pilate as more violent. And the thing is that I think you point out, if I remember correctly, is that Josephus, if wanted to say, if Jews behave well, the governor will respond in kind. And if you're more violent, well, see what
Yeah.
happened to the Jewish war, right?
Mm.
So I
Yeah.
that's the message.
Yeah, it's more a question of the difference between the two books. So Josephus's Jewish War was written probably around about 75 CE, just a few years after the Jewish revolt against Rome. So he's reflecting on this and the terrible things that happened in the revolt including especially the destruction of the temple. And so he's kind of reflecting on this. And in his introduction to that book, he says that, people will realize that if you're sort of accommodating and quiet and, go about things in a quiet sort of way, you'll get what you want. But if you resort to arms and violence, you won't. There will be vengeance on you. And the two stories that he has about Pilate, I think, perfectly encapsulate this. So in one of the stories, Pilate brings in some troops into Jerusalem that have images of the emperor on them. And so the people get very upset. They go to Pilate's headquarters in Caesarea, and they just stand there quietly, protesting for 5 days and 5 nights, Josephus says. And so then on the last day, Pilate by this time is getting really sick of having people around his home. And so he sends out the troops to try and slash them down. And Josephus says all the people, they bared their necks and said, kill us. We'd rather die than see our ancestral customs trampled underfoot. And Pilate apparently was so amazed by all of this that he said, well, okay, if it means so much to you, I'll move the troops. And so in that incident, by not resorting to arms, by just saying, we're willing to die for our beliefs, they get what they want. Whereas the next story is one in which Pilate is supposedly building an aqueduct for Jerusalem, and he uses some money from the temple. Something goes wrong, though. And so next time Pilate is in Jerusalem, all the people start, they besiege him with angry clamor, Josephus says. They stand around him. They're very annoyed. They're shouting at him. And Pilate sends in troops, and a bloodbath ensues. People are running away, they're trampled, lots of people are killed. And so I think the message of that story, again, is the opposite to the previous one. It's that, if you start being angry and you take matters into your own hands, you shout at the prefect, then things are going to escalate and bad things happen. So these two stories kind of are a microcosm of the wider story of the Jewish war, which is really, it's best not to take up arms. If you want to get your point across, do so quietly. Just tell people what you want, what you hope for. What the Jews did in the Jewish revolt was completely the wrong thing.
One question that I want to ask you is, what does the archaeological evidence tell us about Pilate?
Well, the interesting thing about the archaeological evidence is that there's more and more of it. We keep getting more. So when I wrote the book, 27 years ago now, there were only really 2 things. So the most important thing, I suppose, is an inscription that was found in Caesarea, which was the governor's headquarters. This is this sort of beautiful Gentile city built on the coast by Herod the Great. And the inscription, sadly, only half of it now remains, but enough to tell us that it was put up by someone called Pontius Pilatus, and he was prefectus of Judea. So it is important, although I wish that we knew what was on the left-hand side, because Pilate would have had 3 names. So he would have been called something like Marcus Pontius Pilatus or Gaius, and I would love to know what his first name was. But anyway, so we have half of this inscription, and one common idea is that it was on a lighthouse or something like that. Maybe he built a lighthouse in in Caesarea and dedicated it to the emperor Tiberius. Though we don't know exactly what kind of building it was, but clearly he's building something useful for Caesarea, and he's dedicating it to the emperor. And then the other thing that we had at the time was some coins that Pilate minted, some tiny, tiny little bronze coins, the smallest possible denomination. And the interesting thing about them is that they don't have any graven images on. They don't have faces or animals. They do have things that are linked to the cult. So they have a thing for wine, a vessel for putting wine in, and a sort of a staff, a stick that was used in augury or prophecy. Um, Whether people would have found those offensive or not, I think is difficult to know, but they were certainly cultic elements. But since then, we've found a couple more things. One is a beautiful sort of monumental pathway or sort of road that's going up to the temple in Jerusalem, and that's now been dated from the coins underneath the lowest level to the time of Pilate. So it looks as though Pilate was the first one to actually sort of, you know, to start building this monumental road, which is quite interesting. Suggests that he's interested in sort of beautifying the city, doing good things for Jerusalem, and that maybe fits in with this aqueduct that he also built for Jerusalem, because Jerusalem, of course, is on a hill, so water is difficult there, and having a ready supply of water is good for the people, good for the temple. And there are various aqueducts that have been found that maybe relate to this aqueduct built by Pilate. And the last thing that's been found, it was found in the 60s, but only really published quite recently, is a little tin ring that says Pilato on it. So of Pilate, belonging to Pilate, something like that. Now, it's very unlikely that this ring was worn by Pilate, because he would have had a gold ring. I mean, he was a Roman knight. But maybe this was worn by one of his administrators, and it may have been a sort of a seal, you know, for wax, to put on letters or receipts or something like that. And maybe it was somebody who was acting with the authority of Pilate. So Pilate is not a common name. So again, to have Pilato on something is really quite interesting. So yeah, we're getting more and more information about this Roman prefect. So that's quite exciting.
One of the things that puzzles me um, about the term prefect is that when you go to the Gospels or you go to Josephus, they call him a procurator. You know, and is this a case of retro projection, retro projecting a title, a later title to the past?
Yeah, probably. So I've been saying the province of Judea. It's actually uncertain whether Judea was a separate province at the time. When I wrote the book, I just assumed it was. One of the difficulties is that in one of Josephus's works, he says it's a province. In the other one, he says it's a sort of a adjoining bit of Syria. Nowadays, I think scholarly consensus is that Judea didn't become a province until probably after Agrippa the First, so maybe about 44 CE. So Pilate then is, I mean, it is a separate little territory, but he's very much under the direction of the legate of Syria, up in Antioch. But he has probably a certain amount of sort of rule over this territory himself. So everybody gives him a different title, as you say. Josephus calls him procurator. Probably what Josephus is doing is using the titles that people had in his own day, because it seems that there was a change in provincial titles under Claudius. Prior to Claudius, around about the 50s or so, they were known as prefects. And then after that, they seem to have been mainly known as procurators. Some people suggest that there's a procurator is more to do with finances. Maybe once the province has become more acclimatized, more Romanized, prefect is a military title. But yeah, I mean, certainly the stone from Caesarea proves, I think, beyond doubt that his title was prefect of Judea. And the Gospels just call him what they like, usually hegemon, which just means governor. So they just sort of hedge their bets, and they're not too bothered about giving him his exact title, I think.
Um, Another thing, how did he lose power? How did Pilate, you know, lo stop being the prefect of Judea? Um,
Yeah, well, this is the story that Josephus gives us in the Antiquities of the Jews. This is the extra story that he throws into this account. And he says that it's all to do with the Samaritan people. So the Samaritans were expecting a Messiah like the Jews, and they called their Messiah the Taheb. And Josephus says that a man appeared saying he was the Taheb, and he was gathering a crowd of people at the foot of Mount Gerizim, which is the sort of the Samaritan sacred mountain. And his plan was to lead the people up the mountain, and there he was going to show them sacred things that had been buried there by Moses, years ago in antiquity. And so the people are all gathering, and they're all ready to go up this mountain. But the strange thing is, Josephus says that they're armed, they've got weapons. And when Pilate hears about this, he sends in the cavalry and they cut the people down. There's lots and lots of casualties. The Taheb himself is rounded up and executed. All the ringleaders go. And that seems to be the end of the affair. And that's generally what provincial governors do if you get a gathering of people, particularly if they've got weapons. But then there's a sort of a sequel to the story, and the leaders of the Samaritans go to the legate of Syria in Antioch, and they complain about Pilate. They say they're refugees from the persecution of Pilate, and the legate of Syria decides that he'll send Pilate back to Rome to answer the charges. Now, we don't know whether that means that the legate thought that Pilate was to blame, or he just thought, this is above my pay grade, I'm going to send him back to the emperor and let the emperor decide. Anyway, Pilate supposedly hurried off to Rome, doubtless to get his story told to the emperor before anybody else could. And when he got there, Tiberius had just died. Gaius Caligula was now on the throne. And we don't know what happened after that. So maybe Caligula tried Pilate and decided he was to blame. Maybe he was punished. Maybe he was executed. More likely, I think, Caligula just decided, well, he's not going to have too much sympathy for a group of Samaritans who are gathering with weapons. I think he's far more likely to have taken Pilate's side in all of this. Maybe he just decided that after 10 years in the province, Pilate had done enough there. Maybe he thought it would be difficult to send Pilate back, bad blood on both sides. So I think he probably sent him somewhere else, but we don't know. I mean, because we don't have a complete record of which provincial governors were in which province. I mean, it's really only in Judea that we have such a good account because of Josephus. If it wasn't for Josephus, we'd know almost nothing.
Yeah. Now let's move to the Gospels. The the picture that most people have of, I mean, more than modern pictures that we have of Pontius Pilate are mostly derived from the Gospels
Mm,
for evident reasons.
mm,
But each Gospel gives you a different portrait slightly, you
mm,
know. But the bottom line, which I find very interesting, is that somehow he didn't find fault regarding Jesus.
mm,
But, the poor guy didn't have any choice but to condemn him because the Jewish leaders or the Jews, whichever the gospel, uh, asked, to asked for him to be condemned to the crucifixion. Uh, that is very peculiar. What are your thoughts about that?
yeah, I think it's very peculiar. I doubt that that's much to do with history. I think it's far more to do with the rhetoric of the gospel writers. So they want to put, I mean, starting with Mark, who's the earliest gospel, and all of the others are probably basing their account on Mark's earliest account. And Mark wants to put blame for the death of Jesus on the Jewish leaders. I think he thinks that the whole fall of Jerusalem and the temple is because the Jewish leaders put Jesus to death. I mean, I think he sees it in this sort of Deuteronomistic way, this sort of Old Testament way of saying, why did the temple fall? It was because of sin. What was the sin? It was because the Jewish leaders put Jesus to death. And so I think he's very much kind of placing the blame on the leaders of his own nation. And that means that he has to kind of take off some of the blame from Pilate. And then he's in a bit of a difficult position because crucifixion was a Roman penalty. It's not a Jewish penalty. In fact, Jews probably had lost the right of capital punishment at that time anyway. So so he has this difficulty that he needs to get Jesus onto the cross, but he wants to put as much blame as possible onto the Jewish leadership. And so he has this sort of double trial thing where he has a trial in front of the Jews who condemn him to death, and then they almost start again in front of Pilate. And all the time it's the Jewish chief priests who are pushing him into it. They're pushing him to execute Jesus. They're pushing the crowd to shout for Barabbas rather than Jesus. And in the end, Pilate seems to be losing the peace, and he sends Jesus to the cross just to keep the crowd happy. So you have this very strange portrait of a Roman governor. I mean, I think in the first century it would have been, Pilate would not have been seen quite as weak as we perhaps read him in Mark's gospel now, because he is the man with all the power. And when he's saying why, what has he done, there is a certain amount of manipulation in that, because I don't think anybody is likely to have stood up for Jesus and said, well, we want him released, when a Roman governor is clearly on his way at this point to send him to the cross. But yeah, I mean, I think what's happening in the Gospels is that they are putting as much blame as possible on the Jewish leaders. And an interesting thing in Mark's Gospel in particular is that there are parallels with the death of John the Baptist earlier on in chapter 6, where similarly you get one person who bears John a grudge and wants to kill him, Antipas's wife, Herodias, and you get another character who, in that account, is very clearly pro-Jesus, Herod Antipas, who, enjoys listening to him, talking with him, and is very upset when he has to
Pro
kill him.
John the Baptist, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's kind of parallels between the death of John there and this sort of manipulation of the crowd, of the governor, of, various people in the story of the death of Jesus later on.
Yeah, and the Gospels, as you mentioned, uh, have several peculiar. Sorry for repeating the word, but it's like something that strikes you when you read the Gospels. The first, the this thing of the governor every year
Mm,
showing two bandits or two people, just release one and let's crucify the other. And I'm like, but if I were a Roman governor and these are seditious people, you know, I don't want to release any of them, so I can't help but raising my skeptical eyebrow on that sort of information. The other factor that made me smile a little bit is the act of Pontius Pilate washing his hands. That's very iconic in Christian imagery. What can you say about those things?
yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And scholars have often pointed out that there is no historical corroboration for a Passover amnesty at all in anywhere. So Josephus never mentions it. There's no other references at all to certainly to a regular Passover custom in which the Roman governor or any other governor released one prisoner at the people's choosing. Now, as you say, I mean, that would be a very strange way for a Roman governor to go about ruling the country. The people could ask for anybody, even somebody presumably who was guilty of insurrection or something like that. I think it's not impossible, and in fact quite possible, that every now and then Pilate might have released a prisoner, perhaps a prisoner who wasn't particularly dangerous, or a prisoner who, he thought wasn't really, guilty of anything in particular, to placate the crowd. So, maybe a religious person who he thought, well, there's not really any great political worries there. I'll let that person go. So a one-off act of clemency, I think, is possible, and it may be that the whole story about the choice of prisoner was worked up from a single act of clemency at the time. Maybe it was known that a prisoner called Barabbas had come before Pilate, and he had been released because the charges didn't stack up against him. And that was roughly the same time that Jesus was sent to the cross. Then you can kind of imagine how people start to think, oh, it's awful. Jesus was sent to the cross, but that guy Barabbas, he gets off. And then gradually over time, a story of a choice or something like that develops. So there may be some kind of historical piece somewhere in that story, but I think certainly as we have it now in the Gospels, that the governor was obliged in some way to give one prisoner his liberty at the choice of the crowd, I think is really pushing belief. I don't think that's how Roman governors ruled their land. But yeah, and as you say in Matthew, we have this strange thing about the Roman governor washing his hands, and I think that has become the most sort of characteristic sign of Pilate. If you ask people, tell me one thing about Pontius Pilate, they'll say he washed his hands. He had clean hands, old Pilate. But it's only in Matthew's gospel. And again, I think it's to do with this thing about putting more and more blame for the death of Jesus onto the Jewish leadership, and in Matthew's gospel, even the crowd themselves. So in Matthew's gospel, you have you have one person after another actually passing Jesus on, trying not to take responsibility. Even Judas goes back to the chief priests, hands the money back, and says, don't blame me. And they want nothing to do with it. So I think in the trial in front of Pilate, you have him washing his hands. And a lot of people have linked this up with a story in Deuteronomy 21, whereby if a body, a corpse, is found out in the middle of nowhere, people from different cities have to wash their hands and say it's nothing to do with them. That may be the case, or in which case it's a very Jewish symbol that he's using, or it may simply be a more Greco-Roman thing of him washing his hands, saying it's nothing to do with me. And what's interesting about that is that he doesn't say Jesus is innocent. He says, I am innocent. It's me. I've got nothing to do with this. I'm not to blame here. And then immediately following that, the Jewish crowd say, his blood be on us and on our children. I mean, a terrible thing, which again is only in Matthew's gospel. But it's all about, where does the guilt, where does the blame lie in this? Which, of course, when you're talking about a legal trial or sending somebody to the cross, talking about guilt is really an odd way to talk about it. But the gospel writers are really interested in who is to blame, whose fault is this? And despite the fact that Jesus is crucified and clearly sent there by a Roman governor, they do want to try and put this blame onto the Jewish leaders.
Yeah, and I don't remember if it's in the Gospel of Matthew or in the Gospel of Luke, but there is some sort of literary trope being used here when the wife of Pontius Pilate goes to him and says, "Look, I had a dream about this man last night.
Mm.
That if you crucify him, maybe something wrong would happen. That sort of trope that you can find in antiquity."
Yeah, so that is Matthew as well, and of course in Matthew, dreams are absolutely credible way in which God gets in touch with humans. You get plenty of dreams in the birth stories. So here, I think, it's very interesting that the leaders, the Jewish leaders, are trying to get rid of Jesus. At the same time, you have this Gentile woman who gets this sort of, divine communication through her dream that that Jesus is a good and righteous man. And then Pilate, of course, is given this information, but I suppose he does act on it eventually, but perhaps not because his wife has told him, but more because he's just really wanting to try and get himself out of an awkward situation.
Yeah, now moving more towards Jesus. Um, Today we have a variety of opinions about who Jesus was, as if I think that most of the academy thinks that he's an apocalyptic prophet, but there are also those who say, well, but he may have been some sort of more violent than just preaching, or even a revolutionary in some cases,
Mm,
um, or cynic philosopher in some cases.
mm.
That doesn't convince me very much. But my question to you as a historian is, uh, what can we tell about Pilate's condemnation of Jesus? Why was he condemned? I know that the inscription of Jesus, King of the Jews, might give us some clue, But why was he crucified? You know,
Yeah, I think probably similar to the reasons why Herod Antipas killed John the Baptist. So if you're a religious figure, and of course religion and politics are so intertwined in the ancient world, to say, God is the ruler of everything is a religious and political thing. You can't really separate the two, but insofar as you can, if a figure is saying God is going to intervene and he's going to intervene soon and there's going to be judgment and you have to prepare yourself, as John the Baptist was saying, and getting people to go through baptism as a sign of that. I think it's inevitable that at some point the ruler starts to think there's a lot of people there. There's a lot of people getting very worked up and looking out for something happening, and that could cause unrest. And so I think that's why Herod Antipas had John the Baptist killed, even though he wasn't telling people to take up arms. He wasn't telling people, we're going to march on Antipas and his palaces. Just that fact that lots of people are gathering and they're getting worked up, they're expecting things. And in the case of Jesus, I think the danger was even stronger because clearly people were saying that Jesus was some kind of Messiah. They're thinking he's the one. He's the one who's going to kind of restore all things. He's going to lead them. Or he's saying similar things to John the Baptist, but it seems as though he is in some ways being seen as a messianic leader. And of course, he's doing it in Jerusalem. John the Baptist was just out in the wilderness where there's not really any people anyway, so it doesn't matter too much. But Jesus is bringing his message to Jerusalem at Passover, when the city is absolutely full of people, so many people that they're having to camp outside the city walls. So I think all of that meant that Jesus was dangerous, or at least potentially dangerous. And he's already done something in the temple. And I can completely understand why the high priests were worried about that. What's he going to do next? He's already done something semi-violent in the temple. He's overturned these tables. And perhaps they wondered what's the next move, because there's Roman soldiers on the porticos of the temple. It wouldn't have taken much for them to come down, and perhaps some kind of riot, bloodshed in the temple. And it was really important that the Passover was celebrated properly with the right purification, the right sacrifices. So, I can understand why the high priests were worried and why they wanted to get rid of him. But I think Pilate, for his own reasons, would have wanted to get rid of Jesus too.
One another interesting uh, view perspective on Pilate in one of the Gospels is the case of the Gospel of John. Because in the case of the Gospel of John, something in my eyes comical happens. And that is that Pilate, in some way, is interested in philosophy.
Mm,
That is, what is truth? Something like that. And that, um, you know, is strange for me. Maybe it's not that strange, but it's strange for me that a governor would start philosophizing with with a person who is accused of a crime. I don't know. And also another thing that is interesting in the following, the track of the gradual exoneration of Pilate. I, I see no problem with this man. I see no fault with this man.
mm,
And then the Jewish leaders keep at it, and the Gospel of John says, well, so Pilate handed them for them to crucify.
mm, mm.
And I'm like, really?
Yeah, no, no, John's is, I mean, he has a much sort of more extended, lengthier story of the Roman trial. But yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a different portrait, and Jesus inside, the Jewish leaders are outside, and Pilate is the one who has to sort of go between these two. And some people have seen sort of a psychological thing in that, Pilate is dithering between inside outside, not sure what he's doing. But I think the interesting thing about the what is truth is that it's followed straight away by and he went out. He doesn't wait for an answer. It's almost as if he's sort of, what is truth? This prisoner wants to talk about truth, but what is truth? And he's off. It's not a real philosophical inquiry, I think. And of course, the reader of the Gospels knows that the truth is Jesus. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. The truth is standing there in front of him, and yet Pilate can't grasp that. So I don't think we're really to think that this Roman military governor suddenly has a moment when he thinks, let's talk philosophy here. It's really to show that he has no concept of who Jesus is, even though he's been having these discussions with him. And then, yeah, at the end, actually, I think in John's gospel, Pilate sort of emerges as the victor because he has been saying to the leaders, what shall I do with him? What's he done? And all of this. But at the end, the Jewish leaders say, we have no king but Caesar. And at that, Pilate sends Jesus to the cross. Well, that's a good day in a Roman governor's court. If you can have the representatives of the people you are governing say, we have no king but Caesar, um, you know, that's as good as it gets. So although Pilate, I think, is a bit dithery in John, he's in and out, he's sort of, asking all these questions, but at the end, they have committed the ultimate blasphemy. We have no king but Caesar. That's an incredible thing to say, and a wonderful thing for a Roman governor to hear. So, yeah, I think in the end he actually does quite well in John's Gospel from the point of view of a Roman governor.
And one final questions. In the preface of your book, which is, of all of that you wrote, it's one of the things that really caught my attention, and that is when you say that you don't say it in these words, but virtually what you're saying is that a lot of people have today many or in modernity different portraits of who Pilate was. And I want to bring this up because something similar happens to Jesus,
Mm,
as Jesus is adapted according to the agendas
mm,
and to the ideologies that use him, for rhetorical purposes or whatever. And for me, it was interesting to find that Pilate was also being used that way.
mm.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think, I mean, you're absolutely right about the similarities between Pilate and Jesus in this way, that people sort of co-opt them in to be the mouthpiece of what they want them to say, or they think they sort of know how they would have functioned or thought. And I mean, it did seem to me that descriptions of Pilate from sort of British writers at the time of the British Empire sort of saw him as a colonial governor, decent chap trying to do his best in a difficult province. You can almost kind of hear them. You can hear the Bermuda shorts that they're wearing, and the sort of the caps, and very sort of colonial. But I mean, one of the interesting things, as you mentioned earlier, was the use that Pilate has been put to in Russian literature, Stalinist literature, and particularly Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita. I mean, that's an incredible book of the talking about the devil goes to Moscow. The devil goes to Moscow and wreaks havoc. And then in amongst these sort of mad stories, you have this sort of description of Pilate, and and I mean, the whole thing really, I suppose, is generated by Matthew's picture of Pilate washing his hands. And it's this whole thing about how good people can sort of allow bad things to happen just because they don't really get involved. You just sort of, you say it's nothing to do with me. I'm not gonna I'm not responsible. I'm just going to keep my head down. And I think that's Bulgakov saying, this is what a lot of people did in the Stalinist era, and by doing that, they allowed evil to flourish. And Bulgakov isn't the only Stalinist Russian writer to use Pilate in that way, to sort of say, this is exactly that kind of behavior. So yeah, you do get Pilate used in these pieces of writing for all kinds of different purposes.
Well, um, that that is about the end of our interview, but I want to thank you so much, Dr. Bond, for being here. This has been wonderful. Um, t- you wanted to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you. It's been great, and it's lovely to have people who want to talk about pilots, because all the people I know here are pretty sick of hearing about pilots. So no, it's
Pretty
been.
sick of.
Thank you very much for your questions.
Well, to our viewers, I highly encourage you to read her book, Pontius Pilate in History and Interpretation. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Give us a like or comment this video. Everything helps. Dr. Bond, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye.